Welcome back to the Spatial Connection, the podcast where we explore the fascinating journeys of geospatial professionals and dive into the incredible ways location-based technologies are shaping our world. I'm your host, Kelly McGee, and today's guest is Andy Deering. Andy's career began with a passion for aviation, earning his pilot's license and setting his sights on the airline industry. However, after 9/11 reshaped the aviation landscape, he found himself at an unexpected crossroads. A chance opportunity introduced him to the geospatial industry, where he not only adapted but thrived, seizing key moments that led to a deeply rewarding career. Along the way, he has worked with many talented geospatial professionals, and despite the twist in his journey, his early roots continue to shape and support his growth. Join me as we listen to Andy's story. All right, welcome everybody. We've got a good episode for you today. I think you'll find this pretty enjoyable and very interesting. I got Andy Deering with me today, and Andy, I really appreciate you being here. This is a great opportunity for one thing for us to catch up. I think that it's been a while since we've talked, and yes. I think that it's kind of interesting to hear where you've been since we last talked. We worked together for a while, and in that what seems like a short amount of time frame has actually gone a lot longer than I thought. So a lot has transpired in that time frame for both of us, and so it's kind of nice to be able to hear how that's gone, and we'll see how that goes. What I'd like to go through is we'll go through and we'll talk about your story. I want to know a little bit about, first, how did you find out about GIS? What was your first intro to that? Was it in school? Was it before school or at a job? And then from there, kind of how did you go from one job to the next? But if you can, tell us a little bit about the jobs as you go through there. So sure. With that, I'm going to turn it over to you to kind of give us how you got started in GIS.
Well, first, thanks for having me over here in great space. Yeah, my history going through school. So I came to St. Louis University. I came to St. Louis via St. Louis University, and my career path was not on GIS. I studied aviation and aviation science.
Oh, really?
At Parks College or St. Louis University. I went through the professional pilot program. I have all of my ratings. I was a flight instructor. The teaching element was actually kind of the fun part because I actually had to really learn that as part of that flight instructing other than flying planes. But, timing wise, I got, so first off, a couple of significant moments. One is I was an intern with American Airlines. I learned a lot about doing things that I got sent to Dallas, Texas for 6 months on an unpaid internship. Unpaid. So you paid for your apartment, you paid for, all your meals, and you didn't get paid at all for any of that work with the opportunity to fly for the airlines. And at the time, it was you get a billet, once you hit a certain number of hours, they'd have a spot waiting for you. The semester that I went, it was the spring semester of 2002. So if you knew what happened in 2001, in the fall semester of 2001, first off, it was my internship going to be there? And then secondly was, wow, the industry has completely changed within, weeks of that happening in with 9/11. And so I got put in what was called the flight publications department, is all the maps and charts that we're distributing out. And it was the Jeppesen charts that the aeronautical group uses, and all the flight manuals. At the time, one thing I learned about pilots, and especially there, they had so many people coming in for retraining because they were switching planes, they were furloughing people, they were coming back from furlough. And so the pilots don't like to maintain their charts. And so every cyclical time. And so I would actually be updating all their publications. And then secondly was I got to learn that just grind it out, do a good job, and organizing an entire flight publications department at American Airlines. So it was a good experience. But they came and told us, like I said, here's your coffee mug that we're going to give you for your 6 months of service, and we don't have a billet for you. And so I came back, and to St. Louis with no hopes and dreams of flying for American Airlines, other than I had 6 months of experience there with them.
How were you making those charts?
I was not making them. I was taking, and the way that those would come is they would have revisions, is what they called them, and so you would actually put them in. And so depending on where they were in the world, so you had South America, you had Europe, you had Asia, you had United States. They would revise them as needed or as updates were happening, and so I would basically be putting those charts in their books for them. And so some of the folks had been furloughed for 6 months. They were coming back and they were like, hey, my stuff's 6 months out of date. we were told as interns, hey, you shouldn't do the pilot's work for them. They should be updating their own charts. But on the side, I was doing that for the fun of it. But it was interesting is I got to learn somewhat on the commercial aspects of how they were using charts and maps. And obviously I was using them as a pilot. I finished up all my degrees. I came back and I got married that fall semester right during Christmas break. And so my spring semester, my senior year, it was, okay, I need to find a job. At the time, I was finishing up and I had gotten a part-time job at Parks College, flight instructing. And so I got paid $9 an hour.
Big bucks.
But it's $9 a machine hour. So is why the aircraft was actually running. And so if you had a student out there pre-flighting the aircraft for a long time, you weren't getting paid for that. It was once they actually started the airplane, they got paid per hour.
Oh, wow.
And which is fine. You're building hours that way. But it's part-time. What I also saw is I saw a lot of folks coming back from TWA at the time. There was just no career path in there for full-time and for getting hours. And the aviation game is you need to get into the airlines as early and young as possible because then you work up the seniority track. And that's what I wanted to do. So I was willing to play it out for a little while, but then I found out, a couple months later after we got married, there's like, hey, surprise, you're having a baby. And so then it got really real, like, hey, you need to go find a job. And I went to a career fair. And so career fairs I encourage, based on my own experience, students to go to career fairs. Even though you think something might not be there, which I totally was not going to go to this career fair, my roommate came back and goes, hey, there's a guy down there and he is hiring flight instructors. I'm like, well, who's hiring flight instructors right now? He's like, yeah, he wants flight instructors and he's offering full-time jobs. I'm like, great. I went down to the career fair and it was actually ended up being Mark Munsell, and we can talk about who Mark Munsell was, but he had the startup in Columbia, Illinois, and they, at the time, were working with Esri on creating aeronautical charts. They also had the earliest form of a SaaS business, a software as a service business, where they had a aeroplanner.com. It was a commercial solution, which basically was like AAA triptychs. So if you're a private pilot going from here to Dayton, Ohio, it would section off the charts for you. They were current. It would tell you gas prices, what things, and basically put a bundle there for you. So you as a pilot did not have to pull out this big chart or multiple charts to plan your route. It was right there for you. And so they had a team scanning charts, putting it all together. There was really no web GIS back then, but it was chunking it all up and printing it out in a nice PDF that you could print and go. Wow. And so anyway, that was part of it. And then we also had some other NOAA or NGA business and some other things, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. We were doing some work for them too. And so the interesting part about it was, I took the job because I needed money. I will say this, I got my first, offer letter, full-time job, and I thought I was gonna be rich. It was, $25,000, and I was working full-time. And I'm like, I am rich, like this is perfect. And what I realized is, first off, I got sat right in front of ArcGIS the first day. I had no formal training. And it was, if you follow the versions, it was still the graphical interface. It was 8.3. I was not doing command line. I was not doing ArcInfo. But we were working with Esri on building the software. It was part of their production line tool set. It was some of their solutions. They had a defense solution, which helped out with the topographic maps. They had a maritime solution at the time, which helped out with some of the digital nautical charts. The aeronautical charting business was a little bit different. And so they were working directly with NGA because NGA was, they had the challenge there where they were still doing things with stick up and Mylar. And I imagine your audience probably knows what stick up and Mylar is, but there wasn't a lot of colors on those maps at the time. They were as a plain white background, and they really had some brown, blue, black, and magenta. And those were kind of the layers. And so they had each of these layers of these charts, and they'd have a black layer, a blue layer, and they had it on these, on the Mylar. And they would print out stickers with the information, and they would stick it on there. And then if something updated, they'd cut it out and stick it on there again. NGA had all the information in a database. And then when the airport name changed, they would call up the vendor and say, hey, you need to change the name from this to this. They would print out the sticker and they would print it on the map. They would do it every 28 days. They would button it together. They'd shoot it with a camera and they would convert it to a PDF. Wow. They would go to print and then they would print it all from there. The only reason NGA changed that workflow is because the stick-up and Mylar vendor, the stick-up material, was going out of business. They said, NGA, you have 2 years. We have 2 years of material, but we're not going to do this anymore. And so they really were forced to come back in and say, well, wait, we're doing this for the topographic maps. We're doing this for the aeronautical. Can we do, or for nautical? Can we do this for aeronautical? And so,
And for them, that's 2 years is a short amount of time frame.
it is a very short amount of time frame. And if you don't know so NGA produces all the aeronautical charts and data for the Department of Defense. So Air Force, anybody that's flying, and they produce it on a 28-day cycle. And it gets the whole database gets released and refreshed, and all the maps and charts, and somewhat of a derivative 28, 56, or 112-day cycle. But they go null and void once they hit that expiration date, so you can no longer use them. So there's 100 and I'm gonna forget how many charts, which is bad, but we had to do all these 100 charts, convert them over. If you want to get into the nerdy geospatial aspect, they are not to scale. So, or in the sense of a lot of the topographic charts are at a set 1 to 50 scale or 1 to 100 scale. These were not, every chart was at a different scale based on the density of the airways that were there.
Had to be covered in that.
Yeah, so we had to create the boundary, the AOIs digitally, and then make it work specifically within that area and make sure it's the scale of the scale that it's set on there. So we had to break cartographic rules. We had to break a bunch of different things to make them look like the charts that had always been produced by hand for years and years. And we're doing this within ArcGIS. And let me tell you, we were developing, our database would get wiped, because as we pushed an update to us, we would call it. But at the end of the day, I was young. We were working 24-hour shifts. But at the end of the day, that we were so mission focused, and I never thought anything of it other than some days I was out without sleep. But at the end of the day, it was, we've got to do this because the mission required it.
Right.
We knew that they were going to run out of material. We knew that the Air Force, if they all of a sudden they weren't able to deploy their jets in a certain scenario because we didn't do that, it was really us on the line. And so that was, I would say, first off, we were a bunch of young kids there. Mark hired up a bunch of flight instructors, a bunch of GIS people from SAUE, a lot of different folks that were there. And we worked all hours. We worked and very committed to the customer. And at the end of the day, and we were working directly with Esri at the time, and they were great partners in it. And we learned so much. And we had fun doing it. I mean, there were some crazy nights that we had that were working that. But at the end of the day, that taught us really a lot of, one, first off, how to work and have fun, especially under an intense environment. But then two was, how do you be customer focused, right? And to be laser focused on your customer and making sure you're meeting their requirements. And we had NGA in with us every single day. It was a big team effort. There was no, hey, you're delivering on this contract and I'm going to judge whether you're passing or failing. There was none of that. It was, no, we all needed to come together and work on it. And I will say the other part that was really interesting of it is we actually, our QA/QC, which again, making sure everything looked right, making sure all the workflows worked, we hired up some of the people that were producing the charts manually, the stick-up and Mylar folks, because they were supposed to know what it looked like, and they knew it. They didn't know how to run ArcGIS. They didn't know it, but at the end of the day, they knew exactly what that chart was supposed to look like. And so we actually hired those folks back in to do QA/QC for us. And so it was, we did that. We created the Central Caribbean and South America charts. We created the European charts. We created some of the Asian charts. We were doing it with Esri at the time. And then right during the middle, once we got them all published, then they need to be produced again and again and again on a 28, 56, or 112-day cycle. The program at NGA flipped over, and it was, you probably remember these days, there was an omnibus contract, and then it moved to what was known as the GGI contract. Esri was not a prime contractor anymore. And so Boeing, in 3001 amongst, SCIC and others all had pieces of work. Well, Boeing got given 50% of the work in 3001, which was based out of Stennis Space Center. And none of them knew how to produce the charts. And Esri was not giving, they were kind of reduced the amount of work share. And so we, as a small business sitting in Columbia, started producing and training up Boeing and their Jeppesen employees at the time, and 3001 up on how to do the work. And so we did quite a bit of that work share. And then the last thing I want to share about that is, at the time also, Katrina hit.
Yes.
and the whole 3001 organization got flooded out. They shipped a computer with all their data to us, and for 3 cycles of charting, we did the whole world with a team
wow.
of 25 kids that were producing those charts. And again, laser and mission focused on the mission, on the customer, making sure that we met the requirements. So
big time requirement there.
big time requirement, big time. So, and I will say, we grew up really quick in this process. We're sitting there at the ages of 21, 22, 23 years old, just trying to figure this out and make it work. And so I will say that was for me a very, I didn't mind not flying at that time. I didn't mind like, hey, I was still, flight instructing on the side. Actually, Mark Munsell said, anytime there's free time and you want to go fly, we'll pay Andy's salary, and we had another flight instructor. You can learn how to fly, which actually one of our folks did learn how to fly.
Wow.
But then time got we were working all the time at some point in time, and we didn't get to do that. But at the end of the day, I started developing. I liked working with the software. I started figuring out this is what WGS84 means, and this is what different cartographic rule sets were. This is what labeling was, and so. Versus being the SME that understood what the aeronautical data was, actually turning into a geospatial person. And so I get asked all the time, how did you get to be a geospatial person? And I'm like, I'm the non-traditional pathway, but so many people in the industry have come through non-traditional pathways, in addition to traditional pathways, into the geospatial industry.
I find a lot of civil engineers. When I started, that was a big influx of civil engineers that were doing mapping coming into the geospatial industry. So I totally understand that.
And the interesting part about the case study of a small business startup and those sorts of things is we had a lot of people with different skill sets that were there. So again, talking about the people that ran production, doing the stick up and Mylar. Ironically enough, a lot of those folks are still, they worked, one of them still works at Esri and knows how to use the GIS tools and things. And so coming full circle for them, they were doing mapping and charting the old way and actually working for a software company that obviously does it a more modern way. Again, some of us folks, I will tell you that the person that still runs all the aeronautical NGA work at SCIC or Leidos now, she was a flight instructor and she runs that entire operation now. So you can see the lineage of it. And I will also say that I don't know how Mark did it back in the day, but the folks that came out of that genre, they have been division managers, CEOs, other things. They're at NGA and are leaders at NGA. Mark, obviously he's the chief AI officer at NGA now. You saw this lineage of a great group that's brought together, and you see that as pockets. It was at GOI, it was at Kinetic. You see it these pockets, and we've only grown, I think, as a geospatial community here in St. Louis, and there's just been a lot of talent, and it's gone in a few different directions, but it seems to keep, growing and nurturing. And
I think one of the things along that line is you find that people that work in those small niche companies, they got exposed to a lot of aspects of a company. They weren't just technicians. They had to be part of the management, even if it wasn't a management title. They had to be, involved with that. So, I saw that as well, and I think that, for a lot of us, that was a great opportunity. You either you did your job, or you had a chance to learn and do more. And I think, there were a lot of people that were able to take advantage of that and get a broad experience in the business side. So
yeah, we had. And you probably remember those production days. It was oh, you need to be ISO 9001, 2003 certified.
And the first time is, what is ISO?
Yeah, and we're like, okay, well, what is that? And then do it. And we developed, we had a web developer like, hey, let's develop this online checklist. And again, online was very new back then. Yes. And so you had these online checklists and whatever, and we'd be able to do an audit report. And we developed some really cool stuff. Equally, there was, some other capabilities that we would build as part of that, or we'd learn as part of that. And, time tracking. We didn't understand why would you have to do that? But then some people started asking us metrics of well, how long does it take you to produce a chart? We had no concept, and I got brought in, and it's my career into management of that organization. It was so the first day. Let me take back to IMAPS. My first day on the job, it was very much an open bullpen environment. We were all doing we're all doing aeronautical charting. I get brought in. And there's a desk set up, but then there's a flat box on the floor. And I'm pretty sure that the Mark did this just to do a cultural sort of thing and get you indoctrinated in. But it's like, well, that's your chair. Put it together, right? So that's the first thing you did on the very first day was put your chair together. And everybody's just kind of looking at you like, well, you put the arm on the wrong side, but I'm not going to say anything, you know. And then you got to sit in your chair and do your job. We learned so much in that environment of just, I don't know, the camaraderie, the teamwork, and again, you know, we very much had to do so many different jobs. And so one guy that had been working there a long time, he got frustrated at some point. He was like, oh, this script that I'm trying to run, this thing that I'm trying to do, it's not working right. And I was like, well, we got to get this thing out. And he had to take one of his many smoke breaks, went out the door. I went onto his computer and I started clicking some buttons. I'm like, hey, this thing's got to get out the door. And it went out the door. And again, I'm like maybe 3 or 4 weeks on the job at that point. And Mark goes, hey, we need a project manager on this thing. You want a project manager? And so again, what is a project manager? Oh, sure, I'll do that, right? I think it's that, you know, that grit of just saying, hey, I'm just here to get things done. I'm seeing the bigger picture on things. And that was, again, my first, and at the time then I ended up started leading the whole group, which was, you know, again, we had 25 people. And then the interesting aspect, which I still go back to today, is learning how to sell the company. And with Mark, and he had one other co-founder of the company, we ended up packaging up and selling it to SAIC at the time, but having different investors coming in, or having our investors coming in. We had one angel investor coming in and courting and showing and trying to figure out how to value our company and sell it in different ways. And so, again, you talk about all the things that you learned. I mean, there was a full spectrum at a startup. So when I tell people about startups and working at startups, you've got to be able to do anything and everything. You learn a tremendous amount. What seems like a lifetime is only like 2 years in time, but at the end of the day, it's a fun ride. But you got to be.
It's a great opportunity, I think.
It is. But
it's also not for everybody.
It is not for everybody.
You either want to do it or you don't want to do it.
Exactly. And so, you know, after that, and I went deep on that because I think it was very formative for myself. You know, the one thing is Mark Munsell has been my mentor since then, whether he knows it or not. I always take his phone calls. We always, you know, we'll have, you know, every 6 months have a bourbon, or we happen to catch up with each other. And always the first thing he asks is, how are you doing? How are you doing? And at the end of the day, you know, when he decided to sell the company, and he ended up actually going back into the government, yes. The one thing he said, hey, doing the services work, doing this data production work, it's fine. But if you thought about working for a software company, you should go work for a software company. And so I hadn't been looking at any other jobs and whatever, but I threw my name out to Esri. And I said, hey, Esri, would love to work with you. You know, things that, you know, production was going to happen, but I really want to try something new.
And what time frame is this here?
This is a 2005-6 time frame. And Esri was like, yeah, you know, most of their folks were in California. There was a small node that was here in downtown St. Charles, which we can tell stories about that first building that we were in. But
I was down on the landing there.
Yes, it was. Yeah, it was an interesting building, historic, and it was great being there. But we were, you know, right above a dog treat store, and you know, people were coming in and out of the building all the time. But they had not brought a lot of their product development people out, and they had not brought a lot of their services folks that were supporting other clients other than NGA. It was just pretty much their NGA support team that was here. And so I got brought in, and we had a small group of folks that were working on some aeronautical support and some aeronautical services. But it was like, hey, we want you to grow this business. And so beyond the NGA work and supporting the aeronautical mission, we started working with the sales team and say, hey, what other work is out there? What other work can we build and grow? And so one element was state and local government was there, and they needed some help and support, whether it be data migration or those sorts of things. Then it became the utilities team, and we started hiring in some developers. Because at that time, things started moving to the web. 2007, the mobile capability was getting developed. You know, before the iPhone, there was ArcGIS Mobile. There was some actual hard, Trimble units or whatever, the mobile units that were not the mobile units that are today, but mobile collection
Yeah,
units.
they're collectors like the GOXTs.
Yes, exactly. And you had some other things that were there, but really once the iPhone came out and the iPad came out, it opened up this whole new spectrum for web GIS and really doing that distributed geospatial workflows. And so we started seeing different clients coming in that wanted to do that work, whether it be the utility sector, but then just other distributed workforce units. And then about the 2010 timeframe, the agriculture market really started booming. And so in the 2000s, you started seeing automation happening in agriculture. You started actually seeing self-driving tractors, right? So they were actually using GPS data to help, and they'd be able to plant rows, do things more efficiently. They map out their things. But what they were also getting is information from the tractor, whether it be from tilling or planting, to the combine or the harvester when they were through the harvest season, and be able to say, here's what I planted and here's what I knew about that field. Maybe even there was a spraying application of spraying fertilizer on that, and then, oh, by the way, here's what that yielded. All three of those throughout the planting life cycle, they were able to tell more about what was going on in that field than they'd ever had, more insights into what was going on and what worked year over year.
And at the level, the accuracy was much better.
Yes. Guess what? That's a geospatial problem. The problem was all of this was being collected on a monitor or what they call a system that's embedded within that machinery. Farmers weren't GIS people. They didn't know how to map the stuff. It was just sitting in a big native format. John Deere, some of the other precision ag companies would know what to do with it, but they weren't providing solutions. And then you had the seed companies, like the Monsantos at the time, that knew exactly what that information was, and they could say, wait, we can start doing prescriptions of saying, based on you, Joe farmer out there, I know more about your field. I know this hybrid would specifically work, or you can actually plant two different hybrids in your field, because you might have a wet area and you might have a dry area. And so you started seeing the decision-making tree starting to happen about how valuable that information was, and then really how to help farmers, growers, own that data and help them make decisions. Or conversely, the commercial market is how do you help the Bayers, the Monsantos, others really helping their commercial side of business and helping offer up what might actually work better for them. So Esri was in the middle of that mix, because we kept getting phone calls, and it was like a pattern of, Key Ag in Illinois, somewhere in middle Illinois, was called up and they said, hey, we want to develop a solution. Then we had Monsanto saying, hey, we want to develop a solution. And at the end of the day, we started doing enough repeat work of taking geospatial data, putting a solution, creating web services. They were like, maybe we should develop an ag solution for this, or a package that has its own data schema, that has its own maps, charts, those sorts of things, to get to a broader market. And so that was one thing that we led out of St. Louis. It wasn't led out of Redlands. It was led out of St. Louis, and developing a whole ag practice that came out of here, whether it be sales, we had services and solution and support. So that was something that we did from 2010 until, when I left there in 2015.
So that's probably a pretty interesting time frame, because you get the chance to see something from its start, like I say, all the way up through it's grown over the years.
It was fun.
So when you went to Esri for the first time when you first got there, you weren't the professional services manager at the time. Where were you? What was your role there? And then you transitioned to that role, correct?
Yes. So I was I was considered, I think, the project manager for our aeronautical work that we still had. So again, just supporting the NGA customer and just that project. It was interesting. I would say there was two things that happened. We had a small team of folks that were actually from IMAPS, the startup that was here in Columbia. They came over with me, and so we were doing that. But then there was this group that was just supporting the NGA topos. We had a bunch of FTEs that were on site at NGA, but they reported into a different group. And then I'll give him credit. There was a guy by the name of Matt Harmon, and he's still at Esri in St. Charles. And so Matt actually was coming out of DC. He was moving to St. Louis because he wanted to move and relocate closer to family. And so he came there, and he was different because he came out of their technology center that did a bunch of demos, he could code, He could do some data transformation. He could create beautiful maps. And by the way, he could speak and sell to customers. And so and it was like, well, where are we going to put him? And at that time, Ezra was like, wait, maybe we need to rethink this whole services team that's here. And so that's when they put me on in charge of that, and then we started developing practices around that. And at the time, and as you may remember, Matt started leading this what we called the Rent-A-Tech team.
Yes,
and the Rent-A-Tech team was high-end people, developers or programmer developer types, or people that could really configure and munch some data really quickly and help support customers on the platform. And so that was that whole group and team. And then we still kept the NGA business and that whole thing. And then we had a group that supported other customers, whether it be data migration support or the consulting things that were going on, like almost consulting services as well. And then the last thing that happened they brought up is we brought the Minneapolis services into the fold. And they were primarily focused in on commercial markets because the commercial practice was run out of the Minneapolis office. And so there was a great group of folks there, but there was only 4 of them at the time. And so they really didn't have enough to be able, it was like, hey, they just had enough capacity to do a few projects, but they weren't able to grow. And so we brought them into the fold and started mixing them in. And we also started supporting a lot of their client base. And so Starbucks being one of their clients, Target being one of their clients. And that's where you started seeing the geospatial market really like from a different lens of saying, wait, they're using it to do point of sale and identifying like what marketing campaign is working based on geographically looking at different commercials and how we're marketing in those areas and what's actually selling, being able to bring that all together. Or Starbucks at the time, the sustainability, they had lots of goals there and they wanted to expose to their customers from bean to cup, right? Where did we harvest that bean from to know that you feel good buying that cup of coffee and it wasn't done off of child labor, for example. Right. And so they had a whole platform that they built around that. So we worked with some great customers, and it was completely different than the ag customers. It was completely different than the defense customers that we were supporting or the state and local government and utilities. It was a whole different market segment. And that was transformative because I got to see the whole spectrum of how geospatial was being applied.
And I think that's interesting because a lot of people, when you talk about doing geospatial or GIS, they think you make a map. It's so much more than just making a map. There's so much beyond the map making process. I tell a lot of people, I don't usually make a map. I haven't made a map in a long time because I'm doing those things behind the scenes. And there are so many places that GIS and the geospatial industry as a whole, they touch so many industries. It's what I found that has made it a very exciting career. And that was a great, opportunity for you to kind of start seeing that breadth of where it can go.
Yeah, and again, if we had people that all they wanted to do on the team was like, hey, I just want to work with this, and that was fine. But we had some folks that really liked the variety, and for myself, just seeing the breadth of that was really good. And I will say that the other part about it was and as you may remember, we had a great team.
Oh,
it was a fun team.
Smart people.
Yes, and I will say that we built great leaders on that team, and so I got to the point where I had a head of our NGA side of things. Matt was heading the Rent-A-Tech side. We had everybody there, and that leadership team was so strong that I got a little bored and somewhat complacent on that, and I was like, I needed a new challenge. And so again, looking back on that, there was 2 things that happened. One is the startup vibe was kind of calling a little bit, but then the second thing was open source was starting to really
make that big shift.
Open source was definitely eating our lunch, and mainly because big data.
Yes.
So the volume of geospatial data was starting to increase at that time. The amount of data collected. If you think about, we were even having challenges. One of the projects that John Deere had for us is they wanted to. The way they used to do things is, if you had your tillage machine behind your tractor, your cultivator or your disc, there was a pipe. There's a bunch of sensors on that device, and there's a big wire harness cable that would go right into the tractor into this monitor. And they said, we don't want to maintain this monitor anymore. We want to remove those wires, and so they set up all the sensors and everything else wirelessly. which works great. And they said, hey, we're going to put everything on an iPad. We're not going to build this actual monitor anymore. We're going to use an iPad. Just use all the third-party stuff. Great, except for the Esri technology would choke at that much data being thrown at it. Because again, you're running across a field at 10 miles an hour or 5 miles an hour, and you're picking up at every single inch.
And that's a lot of data.
It's a ton of data. And so first off, we were pushing the wireless limits. They were pushing the wireless limits, but then to be able to paint yield or to be able to paint dots of where things are being planted on a screen in real time, we were choking. And so that was one. We saw some open source stuff happening there, but mainly with the defense sector. There was a mandate where it's like, hey, if we can use open source solutions and we know that it works, most of our IT customers that were just like, hey, we're programmers and we want to use Geospatial, they did not want to have to go through ArcMap. They wanted to be able to program. And at the time, Esri's dev stack, there's some APIs to hit, but they weren't hardcore. They didn't perform very well at scale, and they weren't super hardcore developer friendly.
Yes.
And so I saw an opening, and so there was a company called, at the time, back in 2011, 12 timeframe, they were called OpenGeo.
OpenGeo, yes.
And they were a nonprofit that basically curated, they curated at the time GeoServer. They actually built GeoServer from the
And they
ground
were
up.
out east, I believe.
Yep, New York City. And they also had PostGIS, so the founder of PostGIS, the spatial layer on top of Postgres. And then they had some tools that were built kind of in and around that they'd done on a project basis. But their mode was, hey, everything that we build for a customer or for a project, we're committing to open source. They got enough attention from the federal government that the federal government says, hey, we love open source, but we can't actually depend on you to commercially support this if you're a nonprofit. And so they had the investment arm of the CIA, it was otherwise known as InQtel,
Right.
their venture capital, and they brought in some others around us to be able to invest in it and actually spin it out of the nonprofit into a for-profit company. That happened, I want to say around 11, 12, 13 time frame. I joined, at that time when they spun it out, they called it Boundless. And I joined in January of 2015, I believe. And again, a great group of folks, but it was interesting is at the time they had gone through some transitions. So they might have not hit 1 year, their marks for 1 year. And so when I interviewed in December and then I joined.
You went over there to do professional services originally.
That's correct. Yes, they needed somebody. They said, "Hey, whatever you're doing there at Esri, we need that over here." And a guy by the name of Brian Monheiser had left Esri and gone over there. And he's like, "Man, that combination of how we would sell and team sell, we need to do more of that here. But we need to have like the mature adult that's managing the projects and helping build the program and helping sell the capabilities." Because a lot of that work is services work.
Yes.
With open source. You're not selling licenses of software. You're selling services or support around that.
And to touch on, you mentioned team cell. I think that's an important thing to bring up, what that team cell means and how that is organized, because I still find that a very powerful way to do that.
Absolutely.
So you got your salesperson, but you also have that solutions engineer, somebody that's very technical that can manage how things are done and show how analysis is done, show how things are set up. So
Exactly.
that team is a very important team.
Exactly. And so, by the time I got there, though, it was interesting. Like they were going, once you raise capital, and again, once you take somebody else's money, there's always expectations with that. And so they, I think they had missed, a little bit of their year's mark. There were some questions about it. They brought in a new CEO, and she came from a big like RSA. She came from a big security firm. She brought in, as a typical CEO will do, brings in all of her people, left, and it created this weird cultural thing where I think the culture at OpenGeo was, hey, I call it the Birkenstock, like let's do good, and that culture, which you see that with the open source community, which is again doing good for the community.
Don't bother me, let me do my job.
Yep. And then you brought in the suits and the people like, hey, let's hit our quarterly metrics, let's grow the business, let's have hockey stick growth.
And they were like, what metrics?
Right. And so when I got there, I was like, oh, I'm getting to join this group of the founder of GeoServer and the founder of this and the founder of that. And I looked around and they weren't there anymore. And I was like, what happened? Like, well, they all kind of left because of this cultural shift. So that was okay. We needed to identify what our culture was going to be. And so we started raising a round of funding. We were working heavily with some NGA. We had a big NGA contract with a couple $1 million, or it was through InQtel. We also had a big contract with NetJets, which that was interesting because that brought back in the aeronautical piece. NetJets was it was a whole different thing, but they're trying to do it on open source technology, which was interesting. And then we had a few cats and dogs sorts of contracts that were all around there with a bunch of different customers. Ericsson was one of their customers for many years. There was a couple of ports that were there. So it was an interesting variety of customers they had. Long story short, we were raising our Series B capital. The one thing I didn't appreciate going back in and being the lead of the professional services group was, and especially with the startup at that stage and that they were not making any money, was the exposure to the bank account. And the CFO came and talked to me and the CEO and said, yeah, we got enough for about 2 more months of payroll.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, wow, like I didn't realize like how close to the edge you were. I was very much
And this
naive
was
to
a
it.
short time from when you left Esri.
Yeah, it was by May. I had left Esri, joined this group in January, and by May, realizing that we were running out of money. Mm-hmm. And so they raised and collaborated and got a Series B pulled together. It was $5 million, which $5 million for having 50 people, it wasn't going to last a long time. But after they raised that, they were going to the board meeting, and the CEO resigned.
Oh, wow.
So first off, there was a lot of, once you invest in a company, you're investing in the CEO. You're investing in what they're going to be building. And so we had new investors at the table. Motorola Solutions was one of the investors, and some others that kind of came in around it. In the first board meeting, she resigns. There was a huge scramble on like, how do we fix this? And they also had the diagnosis of, we brought somebody in from the outside, and it caused a massive disruption. How do we stabilize this company? And so the professional services business and what Brian Monheiser, from the selling standpoint and what we were doing, we had basically gotten all the projects back on track. The customers were happy. We were getting additional services were coming in. They're like, well, wait, there's something good going on here. And they asked, they said, hey, we see the stuff that you're doing. Would you want to be CEO? I couldn't spell CEO, and I said, sure, why not,
Sign
right? And I'll tell you, and I can play it all back. I know more today about what I should have been doing than I did then. But
You're learning trial by,
yes,
error, and
yeah. So it was interesting. But the great thing about it was we had a good core nucleus of a team. Once I came in as CEO and some of the suits left, or having to do that, it became very clear that there were some people that wanted back in on the environment. We also had people that were, to balance the culture of open, how do we have people that were also going back to that mission focused and customer focused, and also make sure that we're shareholder focused and saying, hey, and we all had options in the company. How do we make sure that we're growing the company in a way that's responsible? We're making smart decisions as owners of the company. And then really at the end of the day, happy customers will continue to buy from us. And that's the big thing. And so we built and grew that company.
And you had an opportunity to bring in some other folks from Esri that you knew and trusted. So you knew what you had as far as skill sets, which is very important.
Exactly. And the big thing that we did, and I would say it was interesting. One thing is we grew the government business. So the way that InQtel works is when they put their venture capital money in, they can put it in a variety of different ways. Some of it's in they'll do a project for you, you get $300,000 for the project, they get some investment on the back end, but you're having to do services work for it. They would also put in some free cash on that, but their goal is, they would love to make money off their investment in you as a typical venture capital firm. But the big goal is, can you get your own contracts directly with the government? And so we were able to get contracts directly with NGA and with CIA. We did all of the things of getting our facility clearance to be able to have secure, people that could walk the halls and support the customer at the end of the day. We had on-site FTEs that were there, every single day. And we really started building that business really well. To the point where we got, a 3-year contract, $30+ million, and it was transformative. I will say that, that should have been the first day, though, is when you start swinging that big of a company, and that was a enormous win, way too big for us, to be able to handle. That's the day you want to, your pie chart goes, oh, we're pretty diversified too. We're not diversified. You need to very much laser focus in on how do you diversify your revenue, because you have a lot of eggs in one basket at that point in time. And but we also had to fulfill that contract and that obligation. And so NGA, for example, they were doing some really cutting and leading edge things with Geospatial, the open source Geospatial stack. They were, really prototyping out scalable cloud architecture. And so GeoServer, for example, it liked to be on one device, one piece of hardware. It liked to have the storage close. When you go to the cloud and you have distributed kind of capabilities, so they paid for, hey, can you make a cloud native GeoServer capability? Can you make it work and scale up? Can you make it have microservices that can kind of attach and talk to it? And so we were doing some fun stuff like that. And equally, our commercial side of the business was growing. We actually lost, NetJets kind of wound down, but we gained other ones like an agriculture customer that was in Canada, which they were choking on basically Planet Labs imagery that they were getting every single day. They were getting a hard drive dropped off to them every single day. They were supposed to process all that stuff, create new information products out of it. They were using
Planet was really ramping up here with feeding a lot more imagery at a much faster pace than we were used to.
Exactly, and that type of data that Planet was collecting was very instrumental. If you think about the growing season, each day counts. Each day that seed is growing, each day something's happening from a weather pattern, and they want to be able to monitor, hey, do we apply enough nitrogen? Are we seeing this? Where do we need to apply certain pesticides or herbicides or those sorts of things? Like the monitoring aspect and being able to shoot once a day was pretty significant. The problem is they were choking. Like these organizations, it was Farmer's Edge was the name of the organization. They were choking on it to be able to service out their customers. And they were using GeoServer as an open source solution because they tried Esri, didn't work, used open source, but they said, it's choking. How do you help solve this? And so we created this cloud native GeoServer capability. It was handling, global imagery once a day. It was processing it down for whatever purposes they were using for it. So that was one. Two is NGA was also under that same subscription of the, that satellite imagery coming from Planet. And they were choking on it as well. And so again, we were creating a new capability that hadn't been in the market before around that. And so about 2018 timeframe, it got to the point again, we were burning capital, which was fine. In venture capital, they don't want you to have a lot of money sitting in the bank. They want you to spend it to grow the value. Yep. They don't want you, again, making money or being profitable. And so we were spending it, and I could see the runway happening. I'm like, man, we're servicing this NGA work, we're doing all this other stuff, but we're 9, 12, 13 months out from hitting our, when we run out of capital. And so we came to a decision point of, do we raise an additional round of funding or do we sell the company? Our venture capital firm that was in there beyond InQtel, they were starting to grow a little old and they said, go out and try to raise some money, but I think we should also run a parallel process to sell the company. And so in late 2018, we signed a formal letter with Planet Labs, sold to them, and everything kind of closed up in the March timeframe of 2019. So that was a crazy process. We could go into deep stories about that, but it was that was a growing. And so looking at all the skills and I will tell you, I didn't understand what a cap table was and how shareholders and how their values created. That I learned that very quickly. I learned that being a CEO, you are not the boss. The board of directors is the boss. And learning that the one thing that I learned is you need to be decisive and you need to act quick as a CEO, and especially the CEO of a startup. I'm a very thoughtful person. I want to see all the information. At the end of the day, you need to go with your gut. It may be the wrong decision, but you need to act quickly.
You can adjust later.
Yes, exactly.
Gotta move
Exactly. And so those are things that, again, putting skills in my skill jar, in my backpack, that was, a lot of learning there.
But I think this kind of goes back to, your IMAP days. When you're learning things of that nature, how the business works and stuff of that categories, I guess I'll put it into. When you learn by fire that way, I think you remember that. You can draw on that much easier than it had you just read a book about it or had a simple class on it. These are the building blocks that I think really helps a person transition their career.
Exactly. Yep. And, it was having that come back in, it was an interesting moment in time. Is once you sell a company, a few others kind of come out of the, people will come and talk to you. And so one of the folks that came out and talked to me was Brian Matthews, and he runs Cultivation Capital in the St. Louis area. He was like, "Hey, I heard you sold your company. Would you want to, invest and set up a geospatial tech fund?" And I said, "That's really interesting. I don't know what that actually means. I've sat on the side of the table that's asked for money, but I haven't actually been on your side." And he said, "Hey, I don't know what geospatial is, but I can certainly run a venture capital fund. Let's keep talking about that." And secondly was, in the St. Louis geospatial ecosystem was really starting. So in 2017, NGA made the decision actually 2016, they made the decision of staying in St. Louis. In 2017, a lot of leaders started coming in about this saying, wait, I didn't even know there was a government agency in downtown St. Louis, right? Because they kind of kept everything on the radar. And they said, what is this geospatial stuff? You started seeing more people who never said geospatial in their lives saying geospatial in St. Louis. And some of the headlines with KSDK or others like spy agency, and once you realize what NGA does, sure, there's some element of that, but mostly it's like, hey, we're producing maps and charts and data to support the warfighter, right?
We've been doing this a long time.
Yes, it's not novel. And so there was a lot of leaders around the ecosystem said, hey, this, first off, they're putting $2 billion of investment in North St. Louis, which that's, was the biggest single investment by the government in St. Louis ever. And by the way, there's a lot of things going on with geospatial in St. Louis. There's a lot of people here doing that. And so they did this whole study about how many, employees were here that did core geospatial that worked for a company that did geospatial or that did something that was related to geospatial. And they said, how many of those people, what's the economic impact, all these sorts of things. And they said, man, this is really something here. I kind of came in on the tail end. I got asked some of those questions as the CEO of Boundless. But after I sold my company, Jason Hall at the time, which he ended up becoming the CEO of Greater St. Louis Inc., but at the time, he was working directly with Andy Taylor, and Andy Taylor being the chairman of Enterprise and being one of the biggest philanthropists in the St. Louis region. They were trying to figure out, like, what are some bets I could place on similar to what we did and what the region did in the early 2000s around biotech, which was, we had a lot of great folks that were in and around the sciences of DNA, whether it be plant DNA or whether it be human DNA. There was a lot of talent around that. You had Washington University here as a great research institute doing hundreds of millions of dollars of research on it. But you also had Purina and you had Bayer, Monsanto, yeah. They were doing, gene editing to support, all the GMO sorts of, and however you feel about it, but right. All of that work there to create genetically modified seeds. Basically, Dr. Danforth put together a roundtable of local leaders, philanthropists, and others, and said, we are going to do this here. We're going to create a center of excellence around plant and life sciences. And they created a report, they created a roadmap, they got philanthropic investment, they organized research around it to say, we're going to be the world class at this. And so if you look today in St. Louis, that's one of our keystones that we have here around that. So you look at the Danforth Plant Science Center, you look at what Washington University is doing, you look at the new companies that have been formed here, you look at companies that have gone public here. It's all because of that single investment. So Andy knew about that. Then he said, hey, what can I do to leave a lasting legacy? And the thing that was different than him than Dr. Danforth was Andy's not a geospatial guy. He built and grew enterprise, which is a huge global entity, but he knew that something was there and how can he leave a lasting legacy. And so with him and Jason Hall, they worked with and talked to Robert Cardillo at NGA, and they said, man, there really is something here. Geospatial is something. They talked to me, and I came on board early on as a consultant, and that's when I started my consulting company around that, and really transforming St. Louis into being the geospatial leader and growing a St. Louis hub around that. And so we launched we did more work around growing the roadmap for it and launched the GeoFutures roadmap in May of 2020, which again, talk about an interesting time to launch a roadmap. But in all honesty, it allowed us and it gave us some time to actually figure out how geospatial, like we're a great health center here. How does geospatial health work? Well, we had some great glaring examples during the pandemic of contact tracing.
Timing's everything.
Yes, exactly. And or why did certain populations experience in certain geographies experience COVID harder than others? And there was a lot of different things that were going on. So anyway,
And this is the time when you had Ezra's dashboard.
Yes.
Became a very popular.
Johns Hopkins was publishing that out, and it was sitting there as a viewpoint for the world to be able to see what was
the first
going
time
on.
people really started seeing that map tie-in. So it was
it was an interesting time, and so, but again, in my career path, now consulting, and I wasn't making any maps. I was consulting on abstractly the power of GIS and geospatial, what problems it can solve, and why St. Louis had all the ingredients to be a hub around that. And so, part of the recommendations were we needed to do more research here. We needed to, when you looked at all the universities combined, we did some research, actually some here at SIUE, some at the University of Missouri, but to really build a hub, if you look at what goes on in Boston and what MIT does out there or what Harvard's done, the reason that they're great in robotics or nanoscience is because they have a great research capacity there. And then once you build a great research capacity and you're a thought leader around that, then new companies or ideas get formed out of that. Well, we didn't have a huge hub of research. And so that was the first thing that Andy gave to and supported and set up was growing our research capacity. And that's now known as the Taylor Geospatial Institute. Likewise, part of it was we started seeing there were some startups that were forming and they just didn't have enough capital. And so that's it, to really kind of get them going. Arch Grants at the time set up, and which is Arch Grants sets up $50,000 to $100,000 equity free. So you don't have to give up ownership of your company, but you just need to be in St. Louis. They set up specific grants for geospatial companies. And so they brought in companies from around the globe here. Equally, Senator Blunt on the Missouri side worked directly with NGA and said, how do we move the needle on growing innovation in NGA? And Mark Munsell, come full circle, at NGA was saying, hey, we need to do more innovation. We've seen how there's accelerators that are out there that focus in on specific challenges and they can bring in startups around that. And we can partner with those startups. And so through an appropriation or through an earmark, Senator Blunt got money going twofold. One is they set up an accelerator through the Missouri Technology Corporation, and that was administered through NGA to 3 specific cohorts focused on NGA-specific problems, and they gave 8 companies $100,000, spend a little time in St. Louis, you get free office space, work directly with NGA on your solution or your problem. No hopes of a contract, no promises of a contract, but you get exposure into that customer base.
Right.
Invaluable. And we had 24 companies roll through here. It was a huge success with really a minimal investment that NGA had to make or the federal government had to make on their part. And secondly, part of that money that came through started the Geospatial Innovation Center at T-Rex. So, which was also like we started thinking about place and collaboration and how things happen and having a hub for that. T-Rex, stood up and said, hey, we want to be that hub here. And not only can you have this big screen and some things you can touch and feel and students can come in and events can happen, that's what they want to do around geospatial.
And when you're talking geospatial, you need to see it.
Yes.
And having those facilities to demonstrate and to work in that collaborative environment, not just to share ideas and stuff, but you've got to be able to show this.
Absolutely.
That's huge.
Absolutely. And then how do we get additional, startup funds or venture capital funds? I will say that having raised or gone out on the road and raised funding for Boundless, eventually ended up selling a company, didn't raise a Series C round. The first thing that I kept running into with all of these venture capital funds is I say, hey, we're a geospatial company. And they're like, what's geospatial? Like, again, having to continue to answer what geospatial was, having investors that weren't savvy about what this industry is. Like, well, what is the size of this industry? I'm like, well, if you talk about transportation logistics, it's this big. When you talk about this other segment, it's this big. And they're like, but what is geospatial? And you're like, oh man, it's in everything, but it's horizontal.
Sounds very vague when you're like, we touch everything. Well, how are you touching that? And what is that extent?
Exactly.
And just because you say you touch it, what does that mean? I can imagine that's a tough thing to quantify sometimes.
So we wanted to set up a geospatial tech fund where we have savvy people in, where that is not the first question we're going to ask you, but we want to bring in interesting, exquisite technologies or capabilities that are not the, hey, I want to do mapping and charting like Esri GIS. We're not investing in competitors or those sorts of things, but how are you applying that, or how are you using geospatial hardware, geospatial algorithms, or even to some extent a component of both of those, whether you have a hardware piece that is doing that, how are you adding value to end products in specific market segments? And so that's what our thesis was. And so when we launched that fund in 2021, again, all of those things are happening in parallel. And if you look at wearing two hats, both being on the investment side and the consulting hat, we're starting to see a lot of great movement and a lot of things that were happening all in sequence, where people were investing in gaps that were in the roadmap and the ecosystem, and really trying to promote St. Louis being that geospatial hub.
Okay, so Andy, this is all this information is very interesting. Can you maybe expand on how we see how geospatial is starting to grow in St. Louis? We've seen how there is a little bit more interest in groups outside of the typical geospatial arena. But how do we, we've got the Taylor Geospatial Institute now. That's kind of started coming up in play here. We've got GeoFutures. We've got Greater St. Louis Inc. And you hear a lot of these terms and these organizations. Can you kind of help tie that together and maybe kind of see where do you see that part going? And then maybe where are you transitioning from your part into that to where you're at now?
It's interesting. One thing that we, there's different components around it. And so one of the elements on what GeoFutures ultimately serves at is it's a roadmap. And it's the thing that I had to be patient with, knowing that, again, coming from a startup, 1 year is like a lifetime in many aspects, is this is a very slow process. Change and metamorphosizing a region, transforming a region takes many years, right? So if you look at the plant and life sciences, it's taken 20 years to get to where they are today. And so that's what we very much said, is saying, hey, these are going to be incremental steps. We're going to see incremental growth. It's going to take 5, 10, 15, 20 years to start realizing some of the gains from this. And so
where you're going to get that recognition.
Exactly. And so one is we planted a flag. Nobody else said, hey, we are the geospatial leader as a region, right? So we were able to plant that flag. But then we had to start proving out what some of those capabilities were. But when you start looking at the different groups, we started modeling. Greater St. Louis Inc., on behalf of the Kauffman Foundation out of Kansas City, was one of 4 Midwest cities that got to study what successful industry or innovation ecosystems were. And so when you think about innovation ecosystems or innovation-driven ecosystems, it's, why is Philadelphia doing autonomy? Why is Silicon Valley? Why is Boston this? Why is Austin that? And so what are those components of that? MIT would bring these, mainly it had been, 8 years in the running, but they would bring in different countries or different cities in different countries that wanted to say, hey, how do we grow innovation over here in Spain? Or how do we grow innovation over here in the Dominican Republic? What are the ingredients for that? We got selected as one of the first U.S. cities to come into this cohort and be part of that. And what we learned is, one is you have to think about, the stakeholders that need to be around the table. And then 2 is having a strong backbone organization that will help be responsible for convening, coordinating, and doing that is non-biased, right? So if you have a commercial entity that's saying, hey, we're going to be the convener of all this, it's like, well, you're just doing it because
You're trying to make money.
you're trying to make money. So you have to have a nonprofit in the middle to help guide that is laser focused. That their success is growing the region. Their success is making that better. And so that was one of the elements of where Greater St. Louis Inc., who had this have as a strategy of the 15 counties around the Metro St. Louis of how do we grow and promote St. Louis, the St. Louis region.
And I think that's kind of an interesting part for us here in St. Louis area. We talk about the metro region because, being right on the Mississippi, we do encompass both Missouri and Illinois. And there's people on both sides traverse this river all the time.
Yes.
And, I think that I don't know if that makes us unique, but it gives us a larger area. So when people think St. Louis, it's more than just Missouri.
Yes, exactly. But you got to get everybody on the same sheet of music, right? And again, understanding, I didn't understand the political nature of certain things and why, but at the end of the day, Greater St. Louis Inc. kind of glued a lot of that together. And so GeoFutures got put in as an initiative out of that. Again, everybody's on the same sheet of music. Grow the region, grow this. Here's this industry initiative that was part of that. They launched a jobs plan where geospatial was a key industry sector identified in there. So everything started connecting. The Taylor Geospatial Institute, there was a lot of sharing of, we were connected directly with them. I was helping lead, the GeoFutures initiative on behalf of Greater St. Louis Inc. as a consultant. But it got to the point where, TGI, the Taylor Geospatial Institute, or TGI, their goal is grow research capacity, right? We need to grow research capacity. There was something that was launched called the Taylor Geospatial Engine, and that was starting to figure out how do we take research and start commercializing it or getting it tagged into industry problems. You started seeing these components happening. At the end of the day, you still got to keep a nucleus there to make sure that if we're going to make investments or we're going to do some certain things, it's done in a coordinated fashion. And so that element was starting to happen, and is happening today. And I kind of was evaluating, I've been 5 years into it, really supporting that. Have been doing the venture capital work and doing some other consulting gigs. And one of the elements was it needed some new blood in there and kind of some new energy on that. And plus also, Andy and Greater St. Louis Inc. and others really need to kind of figure out where they want that next phase of growth to be. And so at the end of 2024, also serendipitous, I was hit up by a recruiter and they said, hey, we're looking for a president for a geospatial company, and they needed to have experience of being a CEO of a company, know geospatial, and is a pilot. And I'm like, but it was done as a confidential search. It didn't name who the group was, and so of course what I did is I threw all that whole job description, I put it into AI and say, tell me the top 3 firms. Surdex was the number one. And so I was like, okay, that's interesting. And I pursued it a little bit further, come to find out it was for Surdex. And so Surdex is a company that, been here in St. Louis for over 70 years, doing aerial acquisition. They really, truly a geospatial company. Didn't do work for NGA, but did some production work back in the day for NGA, but primarily was helping a lot of cities and local governments and state governments be able to, taking pictures and doing orthophotography or photogrammetry, providing precise imagery over their state or their county.
At Surdex, they do a lot of the aerial photography, which was very instrumental for GIS, because in the early days of GIS, you didn't have data. So a lot of people trying to get their data into, for their GIS to start with was an aerial photograph. And by doing digital ortho, you had data that you could actually measure from. And that allowed people to collect a lot of data for the first time. And Surdex was key in that. I know they helped me out a lot.
Yeah, and with what they were doing with their fleet of aircraft and a variety of different customers, and even getting into not only working with cities and municipalities, but also then supporting the agriculture customers and others. Again, a deep history, deep experience working in that space. And so, but it was very different for me coming in and not having photogrammetry skills, coming out as an image scientist, plugging into this. And so, but I made the decision. What I wanted to do personally was, it was interesting being a consultant. Being a consultant is a very lonely place because, again, it's very transactional. You're helping solve customer problems. You're doing those sorts of things. But I did miss the team environment. I did miss leading a team and an organization. And with GeoFutures, there was a lot of collaboration and convening. But at the end of the day, I wanted to solve problems immediately, or I wanted to build something, that just took a long time. And so when this opportunity came up, and to really not only lead, so Surdex had also been acquired by Bowman Consulting, and so Bowman is a large, civil engineering, surveying, AEC type of an organization, and they bought acquired Surdex in April of last year. Their goal was, hey, we don't just want to do aerial imaging and photography, doing the same work that you've done. We also want to augment our offering beyond just survey, beyond just civil engineering. Can we, be surveying right-of-ways, but also, fly over a large, right-of-way area and provide, aerial imagery or topographic, topos over that area. And so that was their goal, is like a 1 + 1 = 3 or 4, especially offering more deeper services to their clients. At the same time, Surdex is a 70-year-old company. The Hoffman family had founded it, run it. They were on their, there's 4 brothers that were kind of in charge of it, and Ron, was 70 years old. They were all kind of getting a little tired. There wasn't another succession plan beyond that. And so the best outcome was to sell the company. And then Ron kind of carried on through the company as president until he's like, hey, I'm ready to transition retirement in my 70s, and that opened up this opportunity. I've been really, again, having been there for several months, and working with the team there, a couple of things are very clear. One is I'm learning every single day on the job, right? And that's fun for me, is getting to learn. If I had to come in and do something that was stale, and if you look at my career progression, has been that. But then secondly is also using some of my experience in being part of large and small companies, is that company, many of those folks have been there their entire career. Yes. And now being a part of a larger organization, our customers are our traditional customers we've always had, but also our customers are the person that's down in Georgia that's working with, the DOT down there, that may never have been a Surdex customer, but they're working on a survey job, and they say, hey, we do aerial acquisition. And so now having our sales team know that, oh, wait, you've got 100 customers that are at Bowman.com that you need to be able to sell your capabilities to, whether it be energy sector, whether it be, utilities and those sorts of sectors, or DOTs. There's an added capability. And then I'll say the last thing is we're also growing our unmanned aerial services, which is completely different. Yeah. The Surdex organization didn't do any drone work, or haven't really done a lot of that, and also mobile mapping and mobile LiDAR. And so that's also a capability that Bowman has brought in under my organization, and saying, hey, can you figure this all out? So there's some great synergies in saying we've got a great data processing pipeline that's been fully automated. It was built by one of the foremost geniuses in that space. Can we start putting other data and processing in there, and can we help service our clients better? And so those are all the complex things that I'm working with the team on, as we're still continuing to have 40 pilots out there flying, imagery every single day, and continue to support that type of work.
So you've kind of covered a long way from when you just were learning that you're being a pilot into where you're at. Now you're back to a place that has airplanes. So
it's funny. It has come full circle.
Very interesting. And that kind of goes to show, within the geospatial industry, we talked about the breadth of it, all the different aspects you can do geospatial. And, there's still more out there that we've not even touched on. So I'd like to ask a question of you. Thinking about this career path you've been on, is there a project or a technique or some software, something that was very unique? You're like, that was really interesting use of this software, or it was a very interesting project that we used geospatial to solve. Is there any of those projects that maybe stand out in your mind that was worth sharing, I guess?
Man, there's an organization, I'm going to forget the name of the customer. So precision agriculture in general, and there was one they were down in Murray, Kentucky, and it was a kind of a mom and pop precision ag company that was out there. And you got to see they were trying to be at the forefront of it, but they were starting to try to figure out what is geospatial, right? So they were taking some of these USB drives, thumb drives off of computers and combines. They were also trying to figure out some of the field boundaries and collecting that. They had people on four-wheelers that would take a GPS unit and drive around the boundary of the field, because that's your starting point, right? And then you have to figure out how to do everything within that, and then ultimately make prescriptions for that. And I will tell you that they were agnostic to the type of tractor or combine that was there. So then you started looking at challenges with, well, this came off of a John Deere tractor, this came off of a Case IH tractor, this came off of a New Holland, whatever. And so
consistency.
yeah, and this is pre-standards for any of that. And at the end of the day, I will say that it was an interesting project because not the work was interesting, but the customers they were having challenges. And I remember getting a phone call from the president of the company and said, we're having problems with what you guys are trying to do and all those other things and all the things that you've built. And I said, okay. And, and this was a key project. I say, this is a small company. They had invested, 6 figures into the solutions. They needed to sell it to their customers. And I said, okay, we need to get in a rental car and we need to go down to Murray, Kentucky. Never been there before.
And who were you with at this time?
I was with Esri.
Okay.
And the one thing that I remember is you need to be there for your clients. And that face time, especially when it's a contentious project, that can do a world of good to helping solve problems. With that one specifically, we figured out the challenge that they had. We brought the key developer with us, and we went down there and we solved the problems at that time. 2 things I learned is, 1 is be there for your customer, and 2 is you realize that maybe the customer can't pay their bills because they're in a strip mall on the side of a road. But there was a couple of interesting elements there. And I would say that the other project that we also did that was, maybe a year or so later, and taking that same technique, we were working with Nicor Gas up in Chicago, and they were doing this crazy permitting task management system, integrating geospatial within this whole order system that utilities have to follow. Standards, all these other things, cross-departmental work. I mean, you can see the disaster written all over it, as you know, from working in this space. And things weren't working right. Something was going on. And I remember the day after Christmas going up there, and because they needed to be live by January 1st, and me and a technician went up there, and we had people back in the office. And I couldn't do anything other than be there for the customer, take notes, work and organize the team as the manager of the whole group, and make sure that we were there. Being there, and especially having leadership be there, that works wonders. And I will tell you, they could pay their bills. And number 2 is we turned that from a really bad problem customer and very unhappy customer to, when we left, they gave us Christmas presents as we were leaving, because they were like, we can't believe how good of a job that you did in helping support us.
And that's a good feeling.
It is a good feeling. It's rewarding, but also at the end of the day, you're helping the customer solve their problems. And I will say nothing, and especially in a day and age where we can be virtual and those sorts of things, nothing can ever replace that human contact, especially when you get into some of those tricky situations, because you show compassion to one another, you understand each other better, and at the end of the day, you can walk away and have a successful engagement because you were there in person.
And you got all those nonverbals you were able to pick up.
Oh my gosh, lots of nonverbals.
Well, very good. So we'll kind of start wrapping it up here. If you had maybe 1 or 2 pieces of advice you could pass on that you would want to share with maybe a student or somebody just starting out in the geospatial career or thinking about being in the geospatial career, is there any information or advice you'd like to share with them?
Very good question. Something you and I were talking about in between or before this meeting, but I think, so one is understand your audience and who you're talking to. So, and then I'll get into skills that I think you need to have in your backpack. But I think one is, not everybody understands what GIS is.
Very true.
And again, talking about the challenges of understanding defining what geospatial is. And I always have to make the comment that after 25 years of doing this, I still have to explain to my mom what geospatial is. But moreover, how do you relate it to what they're doing? Because at the end of the day, you're taking locational information and you're trying to figure out how to help them solve a problem in time, space, whatever, in a certain area. And you're using that as a tool or a mechanism to be able to do that. I think some people you do get confused when you say GIS and they think about the deep science or map making
Right.
or those sorts of things. But at the end of the day, when you look at what Starbucks, was doing and mentioned that earlier, sustainability or traceability or those sorts of things, like they're using it as a means to an end to solve a problem. And really that's what GIS's value is you're making more informed decisions by using that information. So just be aware that when you're talking to people, especially when you're talking to non-GIS people, they don't, GIS or geospatial sounds really complex to them. Whereas if you speak in terms of solving problems through the use of locational information or GPS information, like they'll get it a lot better.
People confuse GIS and GPS quite a bit.
They do, right? And then I think the second part is when you think about the tool sets. So if you're a student now and you're thinking about the tool sets in your backpack, it's hard to just, we saw it early on that used to either be a remote sensing person or used to be a geospatial person. And the geospatial people dealt with vectors and they kind of knew what was going on with images. Or you had the remote sensing people who knew images and pixels really well and all the science behind it, but they really didn't like the vector stuff. And they thought, well, that's just kind of whatever. So, but beyond just those two skill sets and understanding that, now we have technology and IT and DevOps and coding and those sorts of things, which the good news is that whole industry has moved in to geospatial. But the challenging is you got to be able to put all of those skills in your backpack, depending on where you are. And again, even if your job says GIS Analyst 3, go ahead and look at that position description. It's going to have Python scripting. It's going to have map making. It's going to be exposure to different software tool sets that don't have art. Yes. And so my suggestion is always, what I think SIUE did really way ahead of their time 20 plus years ago is they mixed the computer science and the geography departments together. And they had some mixed skill sets. Now start thinking about some of those other things that you can start mixing in there, whether it be, again, some of those IT technical courses along with geospatial, or if you're wanting to specialize in a specific industry segment, hey, I'm doing health, for example. Well, guess what? The School of Public Health at SLU, for example, has geospatial or GIS skills. They have development skills. They have these other things because guess what? They know you're going to need each of those types of capabilities to be a better public health analyst or whatever you're doing in modeling. So that's what I was just saying is I always tell a lot of the folks that I mentor is you have a backpack, put a lot of tools in those backpacks. Geospatial might be just one of those tools, and don't get enamored by which Esri version or whatever, because you might be pumping in and doing open source. They might not have a budget to do that, but you have those tools in your tool bag and you have a wide
Understand
backpack.
the concepts, not
Yes.
necessarily the tool itself.
Exactly. And what problem are they trying to solve and how do you get them there the quickest?
Right. Very good. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here, and I greatly appreciate it, and I think the listeners will as well. With that, I think we can, wrap it up here, but I appreciate your time. Hopefully we can get you back on the show here.
Absolutely.
Because I know you and I, we can sit around, we can talk about GIS and geospatial and
Hours.
everything for hours, and we'll definitely do that because I think that there's a lot to share with the listeners.
Okay.
So
thank you.
Well, I appreciate your time here, and hope we'll see you soon.
Yep, it's been fun.
right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us on the Spatial Connection podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on your favorite platform. You can also follow us on social media and visit our website for updates, resources, and behind-the-scenes content. Do you know someone with a fascinating geospatial story? If so, send us a message. We'd love to hear about them. Until next time, stay curious, stay connected, and keep exploring the world through the lens of geospatial technology.